In the summer of 939, the most powerful ruler in Western Europe led the largest army al-Andalus had ever assembled. It was called the Campaign of Omnipotence. 2 months later, his soldiers were fleeing through a ravine, breaking the illusion of his invincibility. I'm David Cott, host of New History of Spain, and in episode 43 we will focus on the political history of the 930s Iberia, highlighting key moments such as the submission of Zaragoza and the Battle of Simancas-alhandega. King Ramiro II of León and his time. We left off the narrative in episode 42, the making of the Caliphate of Córdoba, with the Umayyad ruler elevating himself to Caliph and extending his authority over the middle and lower marches, as well as conquering Ceuta and Melilla as strongholds from which to project his influence over the Maghreb, so that all that remained was to firmly impose his authority over the upper march, in the northeastern part of al-Andalus. In the Kingdom of Pamplona, the influential King Sancho I died and was succeeded by his underage son, and the widowed queen, Toda of Pamplona, exercised real political power in Navarre even after her son was fit to rule. And in the Kingdom of León, civil wars broke out over the throne, and it was ultimately the third son of Ordoño II, Ramiro II, who emerged victorious in 932. Ramiro could very easily have been overshadowed by such an extraordinary ruler of his time as the Caliph al-Rahman III of Córdoba, but this was not the case. He was a worthy rival to the Umayyad Caliph and earned, among Muslims, the nickname the Devil for his ferocity against Islamic arms. Ramiro II of León was a warrior king, but also a religious one and a conciliator among the powerful men of his kingdom. That is, he represents the archetype of the ideal medieval Christian ruler. We will see his main military feat later, but in this introductory section, I would like to focus on some aspects of his reign in terms of domestic policy and relations with magnates and bishops. The reign of Ramiro II was a turning point for the city of León because it finally became consolidated as the new royal seat of the astur-leonese monarchy. Since the death of Alfonso III of Asturias, there had been multiple cities that could serve the political ambitions of monarchs and claimants, such as Astorga, Oviedo, and above all, Zamora. León was gradually transformed into the royal seat through the construction of palaces and religious buildings, the celebration of triumphal processions after military victories, donations to the bishopric of León, economic control of the Leonese area more than of any other place, and the burial of members of the royal family in its cathedral. On the other hand, in terms of military alliances, relations between Pamplona and León under Ramiro II remained cooperative, with aristocrats moving from one kingdom to another. During the period when Ramiro was governing the lands of northern Portugal, he had married his maternal cousin, who was related to the most powerful magnate in Galicia at the time, Gutierre Menéndez. Ramiro did not hesitate to repudiate her when it suited him, after the great matchmaker, Queen Toda of Pamplona, pulled the strings to marry one of her daughters to the Leonese king in 933. It should be remembered that the late King Sancho I of Pamplona supported a rival of Ramiro during the Leonese civil wars, so a political marriage and the arrival of numerous Navarrese courtiers into Ramiro's circle of power served to reconcile and renew the alliance. Ramiro's court was surprisingly diverse, featuring Mozarabic bishops, Jewish diplomats, and even a Berber. The Leonese king met frequently with the aristocrats and bishops of the kingdom, and apart from a few isolated episodes of rebellion, maintained peace among the powerful men of the realm. Ramiro was a determined king, but one who also knew how to forgive in order to maintain peace and a balance of power among aristocratic lineages. For example, he kept as a close collaborator Ansur Fernández, son of a man who had attempted to overthrow King Ramiro, as well as the brother of Diego Muñoz, the rebel Count of Saldaña and patriarch of the family known as the Banu Gómez, who dominated the valley between the Leonese and Castilian lands. Relationships among the powerful were articulated through donations that were not a zero-sum game between monarchy and the aristocracy and clergy. Ramiro II of León took some measures to centralize power in a kingdom with fragmented social foundations. To carry this out, he relied on bishops and on hyper-powered counts who could control vast territories, the most notable case being that of Count Fernán González of Castile and Álava. The eastern part of the Kingdom of León had been divided into small counties for decades. This situation changed when Ramiro rewarded the Count of the Lara district with new counties throughout the 930s, partly because other Castilians had supported his brother Alfonso IV during the Civil War. This maneuver was dangerous in the long term because it gave a single man power over the entire eastern wing of the Kingdom of León. In the western part of the kingdom, Ramiro followed a different policy to deal with its particular issues. In Galicia, the astur-leonese kings who had preceded him had created a true political and economic monster, the bishopric of Santiago de Compostela, which they had dangerously enlarged through very generous donations, and Ramiro decided to counterbalance this excessive power. To do so, the Leonese ruler focused his donations farther south, on the monasteries of Celanova, Guimarães, and Lorbao, also to reward the followers he gained in southern Galicia and northern Portugal when he was governing the region. The main beneficiary through the monastery of Celanova was the Menendez family, whose patriarch, Gutiérrez Menendez, was a key political actor in the Leonese civil wars of the 1920s. This policy naturally created losers in Galicia, and the resentments among Galician magnates had a major influence on the civil wars that broke out after Ramiro's death. The Osma campaign of 934, the submission of Pamplona? al-Rahman III prepared the Osma campaign with the mobilization of soldiers from all parts of al-Andalus and the North African tribes who had submitted to the Umayyads. The campaign began with a display of unprecedented Umayyad pomp in Córdoba, featuring numerous types of military equipment and the debut of the Caliph's new eagle banner, inspired by one of the banners said to be used by Prophet Muhammad. As the German Jewish sociologist Norbert Elias stated, people will hardly believe in a power unless it manifests itself in outward appearance. In other words, one has to see it to believe it. This growing importance of symbolism and pomp must be linked to the strengthening of al-Nasir's authority and to the Umayyad response to the Fatimid threat. This display of power, however, can also be interpreted as a sign that the Caliph was becoming overconfident, something that he will pay for dearly at the Battle of Simancas-alhandega. As for the Osma campaign itself, it had two main objectives: to impose Umayyad authority over the upper march, since the governors of Zaragoza, Huesca, and Barbastro refused to join the expedition, and to attack Pamplonese and Castilian territory to destroy their resources. Perhaps the marriage between the daughter of Toda Pamplona and the King of León was a cause for alarm for the Caliph, who wanted to prevent the union of the different Christian powers. The summoned Umayyad army quickly subdued the disobedient frontier lords of the upper march, and then the expedition, commanded by the Caliph in person, penetrated into Navarre. The Kingdom of Pamplona avoided destruction thanks to the diplomatic initiative of Queen Toda, who went to meet the Caliph at the Muslim fortress of Calahorra. Toda of Pamplona invoked the family ties that bound her to the Caliph, since she was his aunt, and the widowed queen essentially made Pamplona a vassal of the Caliphate of Córdoba and renounced any alliance with the King of León. In exchange, her nephew al-Nasir recognized García Sánchez as ruler of Navarre and presided over her son's coronation, thus formally bringing the regency to an end and reaffirming García's authority. With this agreement, Queen Toda was able to avoid the destruction of her kingdom and to strengthen her son García Sánchez's position over any other claimant from the royal family, since it is said that a member of the Sancha dynasty rebelled, was forced to surrender, and was executed in the Cordoban camp. The theoretical submission of Pamplona did not last long, and the Caliph punished his aunt's betrayal of allying herself with Ramiro II and the rebel lord of Zaragoza with devastations in her lands in 937. In any case, the Andalusi army continued on its way through Castile, present-day Burgos province, and there the Muslims carried out the typical actions of destroying buildings, crops, fruit trees, churches, and castles. The armies led by Ramiro and Fernán González followed their movements closely and waited in hard-to-reach places while awaiting the arrival of reinforcements. In truth, they could do little more than carry out some harassing actions and watch helplessly as the counties of Castile and Álava were ravaged. According to Arab chroniclers, the Andalusis killed 200 monks from the monastery of Cardeña, and the contemporary chronicler Al-Razi claimed that the smell of the burning of the fortress of Grañón in Álava was sweeter than perfume to the Muslim soldiers. This bellicose rhetoric was intended to present al-Rahman III as a champion of jihad, a condition that anyone aspiring to be caliph had to fulfill. It was not until August 23, 934, when the Caliphal army was preparing to leave the county, that the hosts of Ramiro II of León and Count Fernán González positioned themselves on a hill beside the fortress of Osma to stand up to them. On the first day of fighting, both sides suffered casualties and took captives, without the Christians fully descending from the hill. On the second day, neither Leonese nor Andalusis moved from their positions. So, on the third day, the Caliph ordered the camp to be broken and moved a few kilometers in order to force the Christians to move onto the plain. Some Christians descended, but more realized the trap and returned in time to the castle of Osma. The battle was not decisive and both sides presented it as a victory for their own. The Muslims crossed the Douro River and returned to their lands because the campaign had already lasted too long and their large army could no longer live off the scarce food of the area, a situation that would be repeated with catastrophic consequences in the Simancas campaign. The submission of Zaragoza in 937, an Umayyad victory? An important conflict broke out between the Umayyads and the Arab clan that had replaced the Banu Qasi as the hegemonic power of the Upper March, the Banu Tuyyib. The origin of the conflict lay in the fact that Muhammad ibn Hashim al-Tuyyibi had inherited the governorship of Zaragoza from his father in 931, and the idea of hereditary offices greatly displeased the Caliph of Córdoba, who believed that he alone had the right to appoint and dismiss government representatives at will. al-Rahman III was firmly committed to the task of reunifying al-Andalus under a strong central authority, and the submission of Zaragoza was the final step to achieve that ambitious goal. I have already mentioned that during the Osma campaign, the lords of Zaragoza, Huesca, and Barbastro refused to join the Umayyad expedition, while the Tuyyibids of Calatayud and Daroca did take part. The Umayyad army then marched against the rebellious governors and forced their submission and participation in the expedition, and they also had to pay for their disloyalty by handing over several castles. But once the expedition ended and the Caliph was once again far away in Córdoba, Muhammad of Zaragoza reverted to his old ways the following year. The Caliph returned to Córdoba and left his generals to finish a siege that was believed to be only a matter of time before it succeeded. The Caliph had sent messengers to King Ramiro to prevent him from providing aid to the rebel, but the fierce King of León broke his promise in 936 and formed a military alliance with Muhammad ibn Hashim, who was interested in protecting his clan's autonomy in this way. Suddenly, not only were the Lord of Zaragoza and the King of León opposed to the Caliph, but so were Queen Toda of Pamplona, Count Suñé of Barcelona, the Tuyyibid lords of Calatayud and Daroca, the Berbers of Santander and Talavera, and the cities of Santarém and Huesca, all of whom took parallel actions against al-Nasir. As you can see, the situation escalated very quickly. This brief but significant spark of rebellion must be linked to the presence on the frontier of an Umayyad descended from a secondary branch, whom the Caliph suspected and ordered executed, provoking his brother to rebel in Santarém and seek alliances with Christians and disaffected Muslims. The Umayyad rebel entered the service of King Ramiro, providing him with information about weak points in the caliphal defensive system. Ramiro went to Zaragoza to help his ally, who was under siege, but Leonese attacks failed to lift the blockade. The Tuyyibid lord of Calatayud asked for help from the Count of Alava and Castile in 937, and the Christians became the de facto masters of the city. Al-Nasir had to protect the countryside around Toledo from the threat of a Christian incursion, and after that headed for Calatayud to flee it from the Christians and the Muslim ruler, who were regarded as an apostate. The Umayyad troops took the city by storm in 3 days and killed the governors of Calatayud and Daroca. They continued the campaign into Navarre to punish Pamplona with the usual devastations for the betrayal of the oath of submission sworn by King García Sánchez during the Osma campaign. Moreover, there were secondary raids carried out by frontier clans against Castile and Zamora. However, not everything consisted of military actions. As historian Omaira Herrero has pointed out, in the war to pacify the Upper March, the strategic use of pardon was of great importance, maintaining a lenient attitude and granting gifts and concessions to the main allies of Muhammad ibn Hashim. The siege of Zaragoza lasted 8 months, in a particularly harsh year marked by drought. Relatives of Muhammad sought pardon. Some obtained it and others were imprisoned, but the fact is that the Tuyyibid was left without allies. Thus, on August 23, 937, Muhammad ibn Hashim surrendered Zaragoza, although negotiations for a peace agreement were not successful until November. Fortunately, the clauses of the peace treaty have survived to our day, and they can be summarized as follows. Al-Nasir granted pardon to Muhammad, his relatives, and his followers. He gave the governorship of Lleida to Muhammad's brother and granted Muhammad the post of governor of Zaragoza for life. In return, the Umayyad patriarch had to hand over the city for a time so that the Caliph could station loyal men inside. He had to commit to maintaining no contact with Christian leaders without the Caliph's consent. He had to pay tribute and take part in campaigns when required. He had to hand over as hostages his eldest son and the eldest son of his brother. And Muhammad had to spend some time in Córdoba with the Caliph and demonstrate sincere submission in public and private acts before being restored to the governorship of Zaragoza. They swore this treaty in the main mosque of Zaragoza and in the presence of dozens of notables from both Córdoba and Zaragoza, who themselves had to swear to the treaty. In addition, the Caliph ordered the walls of Zaragoza torn down and its tall buildings demolished to discourage new rebellions. It is noteworthy that the Umayyad patriarch did not negotiate tax exemptions, as Mérida and Toledo did. And this shows that Zaragoza was dominated by a single clan rather than by different urban oligarchs, as in Toledo, and that what mattered most to Muhammad ibn Hashim was maintaining his position and ensuring that his clan remained hegemonic in the upper march. What does the Treaty of Zaragoza submission show? That the Caliph of Córdoba was unable to eliminate the Umayyads of the upper march and had to accept practically feudal relations with this clan. That was the price of reimposing Umayyad authority over the frontier marches of al-Andalus. It can be said that both the Umayyads and the Umayyads won. In this way, al-Nasir definitively put an end to the fitna that had dragged on since the Emirate, reaching compromises that provided a lasting solution to the endemic revolts of the frontiers. The Battle of Simancas-alhandega, the Caliph's more resounding defeat. The transformation of the Emirate into the Caliphate of Córdoba brought significant changes in how jihad, holy war, was carried out. The firm reimposition of central authority throughout the Islamic lands allowed the Andalusis to return to a more offensive stance and to take more seriously the threat posed by the Christian kingdoms and counties. In 939, al-Rahman gathered troops from every corner of al-Andalus, the professional salaried army and the Arab regiments, hosts from frontier lineages, volunteers from Córdoba and the provinces, and even mercenaries from the Maghreb. While chronicles claim he managed to assemble a staggering 100,000 men, modern historians estimate a more realistic but still massive force of 20 to 30,000 men. The objective was not merely to cause destruction and seize booty, as was customary in Andalusi raids. This was a true large-scale military campaign, with the likely goal of subduing the Kingdom of León and turning it into a vassal state. The Caliph assembled his troops in the capital, held a ceremony, and had his thousands of soldiers march through the streets of Córdoba to display the Caliph's power before setting out on campaign. Everything seemed to suggest that the campaign would be an overwhelming success, which is why it was called the Campaign of Omnipotence. The Caliphal army, with Abdul-Rahman III at its head, departed Córdoba amid popular acclaim on June 29th, spent a few days in Toledo so that contingents from across al-Andalus could join in, and then passed near Madrid, where an almost total solar eclipse occurred, which was seen as a bad omen by the Muslims. The Umayyad expedition wreaked havoc in the stellar region between the Tagus and Douro rivers, possibly because these settlements lay within the Leonese sphere of influence. Moreover, the people of Guadalajara complained to the Caliph about attacks they were suffering from infidels from the Riaza Valley, in the south of the county of Castile. This indicates that these stateless lands were increasingly coming under either Cordoban or Leonese political influence. The vanguard, led by the Lord of Zaragoza, crossed the Pisuerga River, while the bulk of the army formed up and advanced more slowly towards Simancas, a town southwest of Valladolid. Some Christian horsemen spotted the Caliph's great army and rode toward the hill near Simancas, but they were surprised by Muhammad ibn Hashim, who likely obtained information from spies and scouts about their whereabouts. The Muslim advance guard began a pursuit and eventually caught them outside the walls of Simancas, but the patriarch of the Banu Tuyyib ended up being captured. Those who had prepared a trap were themselves trapped for having ventured too far without sufficient men. The troops of Abdul-Rahman III crossed the river and encamped east of Simancas, while the Christians concentrated on the hill with the forces arriving from King Ramiro, Count Fernán González, and the Count of Monzón, Asur Fernández. The first day of fighting was indecisive, and over the next 2 days, reinforcements arrived from Pamplona, Álava, Castile, and Coimbra, making the assembled Christian army quite large as well. The commander of the Caliphal army, Naida ibn Hussein, positioned himself at the center in order to observe whether the wings needed cavalry reinforcements, and on August 7th and 8th, there was fierce fighting. The Muslims failed to dislodge the Christians from their positions, and in that sense, we can say they lost. Al-Rahman III had no choice but to break camp, either because of Christian military effectiveness or because he had summoned too many people for the campaign and there was not enough food in the area for everyone. The Umayyad army then began a disorderly retreat, pursued by Christian forces. It is possible that with such a large army assembled and the desire to avoid ending the campaign in disgrace with nothing to present as a victory, the Caliph ordered the advance to continue east, through Castile and then Soria, to cause destruction there and capture supplies and more booty. But he fell for the sunk cost fallacy. The disaster was only just beginning. The Caliphal army headed for the Riaza Valley to fight the Christians about whom the Muslims of Guadalajara had complained. But their guides gave them incorrect or misleading information and convinced al-Nasir to pass through a narrow, steep ravine that made them vulnerable to an ambush. The battle is known as Alhándega because it comes from the Arabic al-Kandak, meaning ditch or trench. The medievalist Gonzalo Martínez Díez identified the ravine in question with a narrow pass near the village of Hoz de Arriba in Soria, close to the castle of Caracena. Other authors suggest other ravines, all located in the province of Soria. The fact is that the Umayyad army passed through a vulnerable route and the rearguard was attacked by the army of Ramiro II of León. A rout then occurred that almost seemed planned because the first to flee were numerous professional soldiers from the Arab regiments and the hosts of the frontier lords. This betrayal amid the chaos of battle reflected the dissatisfaction of some Andalusis with the Caliph. Certain frontier lords were unhappy about losing political autonomy, and the Syrian Arab armies didn't like to be under the command of Naida ibn Hussein, the Caliph's brother-in-law who didn't belong to the elite of Umayyad clans. They abandoned to their fate the volunteer soldiers, who were mercilessly slaughtered, and they also abandoned the Caliph and his personal guard. Al-Nasir himself came close to being captured or losing his life. We don't know how many casualties there were, but given the scale of the operation and the defeat, we are talking about several thousand Muslims who ended up dead or captured. And the material losses in gold, silver, clothing and equipment were great too. In fact, according to Ibn Hayyan, the Christians seized the insignia of Umayyad power, including the Caliph's glided mail coat and a luxurious copy of the Quran that took several years to recover. So the defeat at Simancas-alhandega couldn't have been more humiliating. According to the Maghrebi chronicler al-Himyari, it was the rebel Umayyad who entered Ramiro's service who prevented the disaster from being even worse for the Caliphal forces, because he warned the king of the possibility of an ambush and advised him to be content with seizing the booty that had been left behind. The humiliation could not have been greater for someone who had adopted the epithet al-Nasir li-din Allah, he who brings victory to God's religion, and for a campaign that had been called the Campaign of Omnipotence and was meant to demonstrate the absolute power of the Caliph. Rather, it was the Campaign of Impotence. The consequences of the Battle of Simancas-alhandega. The Battle of Simancas-alhandega had broad and long-lasting consequences, and it can be considered one of the most important battles in the history of medieval Iberia. When the Caliph and his decimated army returned to Córdoba, he immediately ordered exemplary punishments. The frontier lords who had abandoned him during the battle were branded as hypocrites and false Muslims. The first to perish was Fortun, Lord of Huesca, who was made a scapegoat and presented as chiefly responsible for the rout. Captured after his desertion, his tongue was cut out before he was taken to Córdoba, where he was crucified alive. Even mutilated and unable to speak, Fortun managed to spit at the Caliph before dying. Al-Rahman III did not consider this punishment sufficient. He ordered the construction of a platform with 10 crosses in front of the Bab al-Suda, the gate traditionally used for public displays of Umayyad authority. The setting carried a strong symbolic meaning. The palace behind the gate represented heaven, the gate itself hell, and the race platformed the boundary between salvation and damnation. The message was unmistakable. Disobedience to the Caliph was a sin, and eternal punishment awaited those who defied him. The execution of 10 additional men was deliberately staged on the 10th day of the 12th month of the Islamic calendar, coinciding with the Feast of Sacrifice. The condemned thus became a collective expiation for the army's betrayal. The victims were 10 officers of the Arab regiments who had deserted at Alhándega. Unaware of their fate when they awoke that morning, they begged for mercy. But al-Rahman, enraged by their excuses, publicly reproached them. Addressing the Cordoban crowd, al-Nasir expressed with extraordinary clarity the implicit social contract between rulers and ruled in al-Andalus when he uttered these words, quote, "Look at these poor people. Have they not granted us authority, making themselves our submissive servants so that we might defend and protect them? But if we make ourselves their equals in cowardice before the enemy and in lack of resolve, in what way are we superior to them, if we seek only to save our own lives, even at the cost of theirs? God forbid it! Taste the consequences of your actions." End quote. After his speech, he ordered the officers to be killed with spears while crucified. According to Ibn Hayyan, the spectacle was so horrific that at least one witness fainted. The brutality was deliberate. He intended to terrorize the population and to reaffirm caliphal power. Simancas-alhandega deeply shook al-Rahman III. His life had been endangered, largely due to betrayal, shattering his self-image as an invincible ruler. The Caliph seems to have been traumatized by the experience and came to understand the risks of leading armies firsthand. From then on, he withdrew to a more secluded and secure life in his new palace city of Madinat al-Zara. Although al-Rahman continued to present himself as the leader of victorious armies and the champion of holy war, Simancas marked the end of the Caliph's personally leading campaigns, with very few exceptions. Military command was delegated to relatives, clients, and frontier lords, while the Caliph maintained symbolic leadership through the organization of annual raids. The Battle of Simancas-alhandega also produced a fundamental shift in military strategy. Large, heavily propagandized campaigns were abandoned in favor of smaller, more flexible raids that proved more effective in the long run. This approach contributed significantly to the political and military dominance of the Caliphate of Córdoba in the decades following Simancas. Volunteer levies and mass infantry forces declined in importance. These troops slowed movement in enemy territory, increased operational risks, and created logistical problems that forced campaigns to be cut short. The Caliph of Córdoba learned the lesson that bigger does not always mean better. Instead, armies came to rely primarily on professional soldiers like cavalry, North African mercenaries, and slave troops. This professionalization would later play a decisive role in the civil war that brought down the Umayyads. Frontier elites were central to this new strategy. Al-Nasir effectively granted several border territories to local ruling clans on a hereditary basis, limiting himself to confirming their appointments. Ibn Hayyan justified this policy by noting that these families had long been established in the region and had fulfilled their duty to defend Islam's borders. As a result, city garrisons no longer faced Christian incursions alone. Instead, frontier-wide mobilizations were organized under recognized lineages, allowing these families to centralize local and regional power. This process laid the groundwork for their later transformation into the rulers of Taifa kingdoms. The absence of major rebellions during the latter half of al-Rahman III's reign and throughout that of his son al-Hakam II suggests that this balance between central authority and frontier autonomy was acceptable to both sides. The defeat also raised Muslim awareness of the need to better define and fortify the frontier. In 946, Medina Celi, in Soria province, was rebuilt as an advanced military outpost, and new fortresses were constructed across the Islamic borderlands from Santarém to Huesca. In this sense, the Caliphate of Córdoba emerged from Simancas militarily stronger both offensively and defensively. Yet the reforms that strengthened the Caliphate weakened the Umayyad dynasty itself. Simancas marked a turning point in the relationship between rulers and subjects. From this moment onward, the Umayyads increasingly withdrew into palace life, distancing themselves from the realities of the country. This pattern, seen elsewhere in the Islamic world, despite Sunni warnings against seclusion, allowed small inner circles of courtiers, eunuchs, and soldiers to conspire and usurp real power when the opportunity presented itself. Locking oneself away in a magnificent palace may seem the safest way to preserve one's life, but isolating oneself from reality is the first step towards losing power. The consequences of Simancas were not limited to al-Andalus. In the Kingdom of León, Ramiro II capitalized on his victory by incorporating the Tormes River Valley, including Salamanca and Ledesma, while Count Fernán González secured Sepúlveda. Ramiro soon sought negotiations with the Caliph, likely hoping to secure recognition of his territorial gains. al-Rahman III, however, prioritized revenge and authorized 11 incursions over the following 2 years before agreeing to talks. Negotiations were lengthy and difficult. The prominent Andalusi Jewish courtier Hasdai bin Shaprut served as ambassador, and this reflected the broader use of Jewish diplomats by both Muslim and Christian rulers. After 7 months, peace was concluded in 941 with the involvement of Mozarabic bishops. The agreement included the release of the Lord of Zaragoza and the return of parts of the Caliph's Quran lost during the battle, while also clarifying the frontier between León and Córdoba. The king of Pamplona was associated with the treaty, and Ibn Hayyan explicitly mentions Fernán González and other counts, which underscores their political importance and autonomy. Although the truce didn't last long, it allowed both sides to recover. Simancas is remembered not for territorial expansion, but as the first major Christian victory over the Andalusies. While it brought Ramiro II great prestige, Christian triumph was short-lived. In the decades that followed, al-Andalus intervened extensively in Christian politics, effectively reducing northern kingdoms to satellite states. The best years of al-Andalus were about to begin. The verdict. In today's verdict, we examine the political theory that anchored Umayyad rule. Their legitimacy rested on 3 pillars: an ancient lineage of caliphs, the right of conquest, and the defense of Islamic orthodoxy. However, this power was not an unconditional divine right. Instead, it functioned as a reciprocal contract where the caliph was bound by Islamic law to protect the Muslim community in exchange for their obedience. This social contract explains the caliph's extreme fury after the defeat at Simancas. When his professional soldiers deserted, they didn't just lose a battle, they broke the social order and made the caliph fail in his duty to protect the faithful. This conditional authority mirrors the Chinese mandate of heaven and the later Western theories of Juan de Mariana and John Locke regarding the right to depose a failing ruler. It highlights a universal truth. Even monarchies and authoritarian regimes require a coherent political philosophy to justify their existence. And with that, the verdict ends. Before you go, subscribe to the YouTube channel and podcast New History of Spain. You can also help me continue with this project and gain exclusive benefits such as 1 month of early access to episodes of the main series by joining the Patreon community at patreon.com/newhistoryspain. In the next episode, we will study the political history of the Catalan counties in the first half of the 10th century. Thanks for listening, and until next time!